Hello, students. Welcome to our first content lecture. So today we're going to be covering Chapter 1 and the lecture slides over Chapter 1. So with that, if you're interested in the syllabus or question papers or some of the intro or welcome material, make sure you look at that on Canvas, some of those top menu things. Watch those videos, make sure you know what's going on in the class. And this is the first actual content lecture. So this is kind of your first day of class. First half would be talking about the syllabus, those kinds of things from those other videos. And then the last half of the class and maybe the next class period would be what we're covering today. So with that being said, we're going to be covering all of Chapter 1 in this video. So if you are in a fall or spring class, a normal length semester, you can think of this video as spanning about 2 class periods of in-person class. If you're in a shortened semester, like a summer semester, you can expect that any given chapter is about 1 whole period. So you might be wondering where I am right now. Well, I am in my garage office. So you can see behind me in my garage, my motorcycle, my little Honda CBR 300R. So my helmet over here. So it's going to keep me company because when I am recording during the times when my kids are awake, they like to come and be involved in the video as well if they hear me talking. So when they're up, I'm usually down here recording the lectures. Otherwise, sometimes you'll see my actual home office, like with the degrees behind. But for today, you get the motorcycle, you get a pile of stuff that is stored down here. So that is my office for some of the time, and then my actual office is upstairs, but the kids can very much more easily get to that office. So let's get started with Chapter 1. Since this isn't a synchronous time that you're not watching at the same time as I'm delivering the lecture, still feel free to ask questions. So email me questions. If you're confused about things, include them in the discussion board. So you've got your assigned things to say in the discussion board or to talk about. You can also post other questions about, well, I didn't really understand this in the lecture. Can someone help me out with that? Hopefully you'll be able to make some friends online. You can even send them messages. That would be great. So let's get started into the content. I will share the lecture slides. You can download these all on Canvas. So I recommend you do that to download those. All right, let's share that. Okay, so now you should see the page of lecture slides, and I should be a smaller box. So assuming it's working, it's not actually showing me that at the moment, but that is okay. So this is the Unit 1 lecture. Essentially, each unit is each section of the course that we're covering before each exam. So Unit Exam 1 covers chapters 1 through 4. So we will be covering Chapter 1 today. There'll be other videos for other weeks for each lecture for each chapter. So let's get into that. I gave a little welcome in the welcome video and the welcome page. But let's talk about my qualifications really quickly. So I have a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in psychology as well. That master's comes from Claremont Graduate University. I am working on my PhD currently in positive developmental psychology, and that should be finished hopefully in the next 6 months. We will see. I was just thinking I should probably have not included those dates there and these comments. Otherwise, I can't always use the same lecture video for each semester that I'm doing this class. But you live and learn. So what is my experience? I've got a lot of research experience. So this is my lab at Claremont Graduate University that I work with. Kendall Cotton Bronk is the head of that lab. We focus on work on purpose, pro-social behavior, things like that. So I have also done a lot of teaching. So this is I've been teaching for quite a few years, both in person and online. Salt Lake Community College for a couple semesters. I also taught at Cal State Fullerton for 2 years or so, and as well as online in some different applications. I've done applied psychology work. A lot of it was ABA therapy. So that's applied behavioral analysis. You might be familiar with that, essentially using behaviorism to help young people learn new skills and have better behaviors, essentially. So I worked with families, I worked with schools, I worked in the community to help young people learn different skills. So my motorcycle will be a little more out of the frame, but I should be small, so probably not a big change for you. All right, I've also worked in my research developing positive developmental interventions. So most of my work is developmental research. So this course is definitely one of my favorites. I've got a lot of information. Most of my research and work is with adolescents. So I've got a lot to say in those areas, but I definitely have worked with children as well, even up to older adults. So one of the biggest things that I like to do is help young people find purpose in life, as well as become more pro-social and heroic and give back to the world. So here is my family. I have a growing family, so I've got some experience there. So growing up as well. So with that, again, email me any questions you have. If you don't understand something that I'm talking about, if you don't understand a phrase or wording that I use, you can also search to see if you can understand what that is. But don't hesitate to email me. Message me through Canvas is probably the quickest and easiest way for me to see that. All right, so some of these slides aren't really going to apply if you're online, but some of these slides will apply if you're in person class. So in person, I would go over the syllabus now during this point of the lecture. Hopefully, if you're online, you've already gone over the syllabus, you've read through it, you've seen some of the welcome pages, those kinds of things. So we'll skip that. But one thing that is relevant to all my classes is even though we haven't done any assignments yet, you are eligible for extra credit. So on Canvas, if you upload a profile picture of you, so just your face, anything, you can have 5 extra credit points. It makes it a lot easier to learn students' names when I see your face and your name at the same time as I'm grading papers or grading quizzes. It helps me get to know you better. And I can also see your picture in the discussion boards when we're discussing. So include your picture and you'll get 5 points extra credit if you include it before the next week. All right, so let's get into the real content, lifespan development perspective. Hopefully at this time, if you're watching this, you have already been reading the chapter. You don't necessarily have to be finished at this point, but I do hope that either you are finished or you're halfway through. So reading the chapter first would be the best thing every week. Start with reading the chapter, then watch these lecture videos, follow along with the slides. Again, you can download them on Canvas. So let's get into it. So development, hopefully you know from the book already, is the pattern of change or movement over time. Development happens continuously over the lifespan. So think about for yourself why it's important or useful to you personally to study development through the lifespan. You can pause for a second to think about it more. I'll probably just continue on. So why is that important to you to study lifespan development? So with lifespan development, a lot of developmental research, as we'll talk about today, focused on childhood and then later on adolescence. There's still the most research on children and adolescents, and that may be your primary interest. Maybe you want to go into working with kids or working with teenagers. But today we know that there's a significant amount of change that continues to happen throughout adulthood, and it's not all decline. There's still skills, abilities, things that people gain as they age. So what might be important about knowing about adult development? So one obvious thing is that you're probably working with adults, any kind of job you have. You're probably have coworkers, bosses that are also adults. So kind of knowing what stage of life they're in, what they might be going through. Also yourself, knowing about yourself. You're probably all adults if you're in a college course. So with that, you probably would like to know a little bit about yourself as well. So development is lifelong. It happens throughout life. And while most research focused on children early on, there's a lot more research that looks at development being lifelong. Development is also multidimensional. Not actually multidimensional like these pictures, but it gives me a good excuse to put those up there. Doctor Strange is one of my favorite superheroes in the Marvel universe. In the DC universe, it's definitely Batman. So multidimensional, what I actually mean is these kinds of dimensions. So you can look at this graph and say this is a child or this is a person, an individual. So this child has different aspects to them. This person has different aspects to them. They have their own cognition, their own personality, their own behavior, their own biology. So maybe they have genetic tendencies to be really good at some things and not really good at some things like that. So every individual has many dimensions to their person. So you can think of any person, any child, as a system of development, which is pretty neat. So development is also multi-directional. So what multi-directional means is just as a tree has different stages of growth, spring, the leaves are flowering out, fall, the leaves are falling, humans also grow at different times in different ways. So early on in childhood, size-wise, we grow dramatically. My 7-year-old daughter is like a foot shorter than my wife, who's a full-grown adult. So with that, her size growth has been dramatic in childhood, but other things will grow more later on. So later on, early on and later on in adolescence, she'll have more cognitive development, more neural development. She'll have more brain cells doing different things. So different parts of us grow at different times. So in later adulthood, we can still have the capacity, even though we might have a fall of some physical capabilities, if we're not exercising and working and socializing, we might have some decline in physical abilities in later adulthood. We can still have great cognitive increases if we're trying and practicing. So that can be blossoming at the same time a physical capacity might be declining. That's what we mean by multidirectional. So plastic development is relatively plastic. So at any time in development, we can change in different ways. So like I mentioned, older adults can still learn and master new cognitive skills. Almost everything, not everything, but almost everything can change to some degree at any point in the lifespan. And that's what development is all about, is looking at what is the average change over time, what is growing, what is shrinking, what are our capacities to learn and develop and grow during time. Development is also multidisciplinary. So take a minute and try to think what other fields of study would be interested in human development and what's happening with the human as they grow. So some might be anthropology, medicine. So hopefully you came up with some others. Sociology, neuroscience. Some of my research in heroism is actually connected to evolutionary biology. So Stephanie Preston is a researcher, a colleague who does research on mice and how empathy and altruism specifically might have developed as a biological feature in mammals, and how that then in my research leads humans to be more or less likely to act heroically. So that's another discipline that's connected biology, neuroscience, that I'm not an expert in, but I have to work with her because she is an expert in there. So we have multiple disciplines working on these same things. Development is also contextual. And you can think of context as setting. So a setting is something like your family setting, your church setting, your school setting. So your context for school might be really different if you are going to in-person classes versus in online classes. The context, the setting that you're getting that learning in is different. So someone who was homeschooled throughout their whole childhood was in different contexts than someone who went to public school. And that's a very different context than someone who went to private school. So those contexts can have an effect. So any of these different realms, so the child is being influenced by their school, by their social network, by their parents, their connection to their parents, by their parents' marriage if they have a marriage, if there's a work network that the parents or both parents are going to work. Those are all settings that can affect an individual's development. Then there's obviously the community, the society, and the culture that a person is in. So think about how one or more contexts might have affected you differently than maybe even your best friend. So think about the settings they grew up in, how that's different from you, how that might have affected how you developed, gained some skills or abilities or masteries while they didn't gain those skills, abilities, or masteries, or maybe they gained some others that you weren't able to gain because of the settings that you were in. So development is contextual. So development involves both maintenance, growth, and regulation of loss. So growth is growing. So something's growing, something's developing. Early on in development, we have lots of neurons growing. Maintenance is keeping what we've got at the same kind of level. So maintaining this motorcycle back here, got to change its oil, got to clean its chain, got to clean its chain a lot more often than I actually do. So because I don't clean, well, maybe a little off topic, I don't clean the chain as often as I should. So I kind of have to replace the chain more often than I need to, which ends up costing more money. Same kind of things with humans. If you're not exercising your body like you should, you might lose physical capacities or even some cognitive capacities that you might not have if you were keeping up with, say, that physical exercise. That's development. And regulation of loss. Talked about how later in life you might lose some physical capacities, but research has shown that if you are keeping up your exercising, you're being social, a lot of your cognitive and physical faculties will stay pretty consistent even into the 80s, which is really impressive without having a decline in those things. So development is also individual. It's changing over the lifespan. An individual is working through life, being affected by people around them. So development is kind of all the things. So you might look at this graph or this diagram and say, well, that's everything. That's so many things that are happening. And it's true. Development is a look at all the different ways that the world and life affects us and makes us change throughout life. So current focuses that are in development and problems to be answered through developmental research and evaluation are things like people's health and well-being, how culture or diversity can affect people in different ways, help them grow, how social policies might affect the development of people. There's a lot of social policies for children. School lunch programs, for example, that's a social policy that can affect children. Technology, how will technology affect development? I didn't have a phone or a tablet till I was a freshman in college, actually. Maybe that's showing my age, but that's okay. And my children, when I go on a long car drive, I give them a tablet or a phone so they can watch a show. So how is that going to affect their development? That's a developmental question as well. Education is very developmental, and then human thriving as well. So we will focus each chapter on health and well-being. We'll have some focus on socio-emotional development, as well as cognitive development. So each chapter is kind of split into those things. Physical development, or every other chapter sometimes, is focused on physical development, socio-emotional development, and cognitive development. So socio-emotional is our relationships, friendships, how we feel, our emotions towards people. Physical is pretty self-explanatory. And then cognitive is our brain. How is our brain changing neurologically as well as its capacities? So we look at how we can change things with health. We look at how we can help people that are parenting, divorced, childcare. We might ask questions like, what parenting styles are most effective to help children have good careers in the future? What parenting styles are most effective to help children be pro-social? Those kinds of things. We might ask questions about education. So what are the highest impact practices we can do as educators? Especially what are maybe some high impact practices for neurodivergent adolescents? So kids that have ADHD. So what can we do specifically for them to help them develop really well and thrive? So sociocultural and context and diversity. We might look at cultures, ethnicities, socioeconomic statuses, and gender as differences in development generally, and how the comparison or even changing cultures, if there's immigration, how that might affect development. So culture, we're meaning the behavior patterns, beliefs, and products of a group that's passed on to different generations. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is a combination of cultural heritage, nationality, race, religion, and then I've got religion on there twice. SES, socioeconomic status, is kind of like your rung on the economic ladder, but it also includes education as well. So you might have heard the terms like working class, one percenters, middle class, working poor, poverty, new money, upper class. These are different phrases to kind of describe socioeconomic status that you might have heard in day-to-day language. Gender is our socially constructed roles, behaviors, and activities, and the attributes that we associate as a culture on apparent biological sex. Versus gender identity is the internal sense of being male, female, agender, gender fluid, genderqueer, transgender, as well as many other gender expressions. So gender expression, on the other hand, is how a person presents their gender. So hopefully you can see how all these different things in life might focus and coalesce in a person changing one way or another. So some of these circles affecting other circles. Someone of one gender, a child of one gender or another gender, might be affected by parents and their social network one way versus another way. There are also social policies. These are government policies that might try to help with things like solve problems like poverty or homelessness. Some might work well, some might not. So with that, developmental scientists do a job to evaluate a lot of current programs. They pilot and test new programs. They try to see what things do help kids get a better education, lead a better life later on, those types of things. So technology, human thriving, we mentioned some examples there. So these are the three little bubbles. And our chapter kind of splits these off into separate sections. But remember, just like that diagram of all the circles working together, and development is kind of all the things, at all times we have biological processes, we have cognitive processes, and we have socio-emotional processes that are all affecting us at all times. So biological, physical changes in the body, puberty, for example, is a biological process that starts that, but it affects socio-emotional. It affects cognitive processes. So our genes are also biological, nutrition, motor skills, biological. Cognitive processes, that's our thinking and how we think about thinking. Our memory, the way we problem solve, the way we use our brain, our intelligence, our perception, how we see and perceive the world, that's all bundled up into cognitive processes. And socio-emotional is those emotional and emotional development. So how do you develop anger? How do you develop empathy? The development of empathy is actually one of the essential things in heroism, it seems. So looking at that trajectory of how heroes develop empathy throughout their lives might suggest to us a few ways that we can encourage more people to be heroic. So personality development, relationships, how we relate to other people, and the social context that we are in are also socio-emotional processes. So again, these are all together. Now, we've kind of split the chapters up in the book into these different sections. So we've got the prenatal stage, infancy stage, early childhood, middle and late childhood. So with these, we've kind of separated them into their own chapters, into their own boxes. But obviously with lifespan development being lifelong, they all really connect with each other. So things that are happening in prenatal might have an effect on things in early adulthood. But these are the generally agreed upon kind of time periods for these life phases. So prenatal is obviously conception to birth, infancy, birth to 24 months, early childhood, 2 to 5 years, middle to late childhood, 6 to 11 years. And then we start getting a little bit of disagreement in the research. So adolescence, some researchers say it starts at about age 10, but some say no, it's not till the actual teen years, till about 13. And some researchers say at about 18 you're now in early adulthood. Some say no, adolescence is still to about 19. So it depends on who you read. Then early adulthood is about the 20s to early 30s. And then middle adulthood is about 35 to 65. And you can see that's kind of a big gap there. So we jumped from maybe a decade or 15 years in early adulthood to about 30 years for middle adulthood. So that goes to show you there's a ton more research on these earlier phases of development than these later phases. So if that's something that you're interested in researching further, there's a lot of work to be done on the development of middle adults and late adults being about the mid 60s to death. So we'll go into, when we get to those chapters, that researchers are trying to make more delineations in there, because it does seem that late adulthood from the mid 60s to about 80, there's some similarities there that aren't the same for about 80 to 90 and 90 further. So probably better to make some more delineations, but this is kind of where we're at in the field right now. And there's also another one that we'll talk about, and that is emerging adulthood. This might be a phase that many of you are in right now. It's slightly controversial in the developmental world. So some researchers think this is a thing, some think it's not. So it is characterized by about the age of 18 to 25. So it would go kind of before early adulthood. And it's characterized by more identity exploration, more instability, a little bit more self-focus, and a feeling of being in between. So not feeling like you're fully out of adolescence, but not feeling like you're fully adult. So you're not adulting yet. But a problem with this is that it's only really seen in the US, Australia, and many European countries. So other countries and cultures don't have this emerging adulthood period. So some researchers say, well, we shouldn't actually call this a whole period of development because not everybody's experiencing it. But other researchers say, well, since so many people in the US, Australia, the UK, Germany, how that they are experiencing this, well, we should look at it as a whole feature. So I'm more on the side of, well, let's not call this a whole phase, but honestly, if we're looking at these topics, identity exploration, it doesn't really matter if you're calling that emerging adulthood or early adulthood. I kind of tend to go with whatever journal I'm publishing with. If they don't want me to say emerging adulthood, I will definitely not. But if they want me to call it emerging adulthood, then I definitely will. For me, early adulthood, that's where I'm at. Emerging adulthood does seem a little problematic because not everybody in the world is going to experience that. So let's talk about some developmental things that you might have heard of before, some debates that have occurred. We've got nature versus nurture, got stability versus change, continuity versus discontinuity, early and later experience. Which is more important there? Are your early experiences more important or are your later? So think for a minute where you stand on each of these before I start going into the slides. So where are you on nature versus nurture? What's more important for development? What's more important for the development of friendships? What's more important for the development of memories? What's more important for the development of your physical body? So think about stability versus change. So you've got stability being you stay pretty stable across life. Your personality doesn't really change, versus change might be you change dramatically over time. Continuity versus discontinuity. Do you have a continuous change, a slow, smooth change? Or do you have sudden, dramatic change on some things? Early and later experience. Are your first 5 years the most important and set the stage for the entire life that you're going to have? Or if you are missing, say, some love and nurturing in those first 5 years, but you're getting it between like 14 and 20, does that make up for those problems? Is later experience even more important? So nature is development depending on biology. Nurture is dependent on the environment. So think about what's more important to you. But in reality, almost all aspects of development are both nature and nurture, and you'll see that all throughout this class. So some combination of biology, cognitive, and socio-emotional development make up about everything. Obviously, some physical development features are essentially only nature, but we'll talk about epigenetics that are in the environment, changing the way your genes are read and expressed. Stability versus change. So we talked about this example of personality. Some things do remain stable. Other things have varying levels of change. So it's kind of both. And it also depends on what you're looking at. Continuity versus discontinuity. A good example of something in development that's pretty continuous is the experience of learning a first word. So you might observe a baby, they're trying to make sounds, they're cooing, they're maybe saying little words, dada or mama, and they get to speaking actual words, and then later on they learn to read. That's a pretty continuous process, like step by step, versus discontinuous, changing in very distinct stages. So the ability to think abstractly, for example, which hopefully you're all able to do and should be depending on your age, that ability to think abstractly only appears when your cognitive or your neurological development allows for that process. So early on in childhood, you can't really think abstractly. But later on in adolescence, suddenly a light switch just happens. Your neurology is set up now in a way that you can think abstractly now, even in later childhood. So both exist. Some things are more continuous, some things are more discontinuous. So it depends on what you're looking for. Early versus later experience. Are your first 5 years the most important, or is later experience the most important? Again, it's kind of both, and it also kind of depends what you're looking at. If you're looking at language development, it's a lot easier for children to learn language. We have evolved to learn language in childhood. So if you take me in my 30s versus my daughter, who is 7, and you put us both in a Spanish immersion class, my daughter, will learn Spanish so much quicker than me. So I would struggle quite a bit compared to those young children because her brain is currently still built in a way to learn language versus mine. I have taken over those areas with other processes at this point in my life. I can still learn the language. Right now I'm using Duolingo to learn French, but it's a slow process. It's a difficult process for me versus she's in a dual immersion Spanish program and she's picking it up really quickly. I have to translate her homework using Google Translate. So I'm trying to learn Spanish as well, but she's going much faster than me. So another thing to think about with development is this developmental cascades model. So the reason I have these two pictures here is because in development, any kind of thing that's happening to you, anything from the context, any change can affect your development. So let's say you are a Plinko ball. Maybe you've seen this, maybe you've not. The general idea is you drop a ball and you want it to land in one of these high value things so you get more points or more money. Development's pretty similar. It's like a cascading waterfall. You might have some negative childhood experience that might point you more towards maybe some negative outcomes over here on the left, versus maybe another childhood experience points you a little more towards some of these more positive outcomes. You make some choices in adolescence that point you more towards some positive outcomes. Then you are in a car crash and lose some physical or maybe cognitive capacities, points you a little towards maybe some more negative long-term outcomes. So development happens in a lot of ways. Your friends, your social settings, your cognitive abilities, your physical abilities, all these contexts that are around you can affect how you develop over life. You might be trending a little more towards some more positive long-term options or some more negative long-term potentials. So with that, as you get later and later in life, you're depending on what we're talking about, your scope of where you can change to might be a little narrowed, but there's a lot of room and capacity for change in all people. You can get to this point in the Plinko board and then bounce all the way to negative, or get to this point in the Plinko board and bounce all the way to positive, right? So change is what development is all about. So that's what the waterfall is about as well. It cascades different ways, more positive, maybe more negative, depending on what's affecting you. All right, so hopefully that gives you a good intro to what development is. Let's talk about some developmental theories. And one thing I want to bring up first is you might not have the right idea about a theory. So a theory is actually an interrelated, coherent set of broad ideas that explain some phenomenon and make some suggestions. So theories are falsifiable. They're able to be proved false. A theory can birth or create, you will draw hypotheses because of a theory. So those hypotheses are a testable idea. You would do a study on a hypothesis. So the theory itself is this more broad idea that's explaining many, many things and can make many predictions. Then you test one of those predictions, and that would be your hypothesis that you're testing. So the more times the hypotheses turn out to be true, the more sure you are of the theory's validity or truth, the more it gains credibility. So let's give an example. Vygotsky's socio-cultural theory is a theory about development, learning, and cognitive ability. So let's focus on this little model of the zone of proximal development. It's very broad. It focuses on, well, humans can develop and change. They have these things that they can do, that they are capable of. My daughter's capable of, I don't know, let's say speaking 500 words in Spanish right now and understanding, I don't know, let's just say like a level 1 book. With help of a competent teacher, not necessarily me, she might be able to read a level 2 book and speak or understand 700 words. So that's what she can do with help. And then what she can't do is maybe read a level 3 book, even without help. She might not be able to do that. And she might not have the kind of vocabulary and grammar understanding to be able to do that. So this is the general sociocultural theory that this is how we learn. We learn from people around us, from our culture, from bringing things into us. And we have those capacities that we're capable of. With help, we can do more. And then there's things that we're not capable of yet. As we gain more things that we can do with help, our circle of what we can do expands and gets bigger and bigger. Eventually, this theory posits that those things that we can't do now might overlap those things that we once could not do. 5 years from now, my daughter might be fluent in Spanish. I would expect at that point, she probably would be. Right now, that is well beyond her capacity, right? So that is what that theory says. Those are the broad ideas. And I gave a specific example of learning Spanish. But you could take this and test this as a hypothesis and say, well, this theory would then suggest that to learn algebra, I might be able to do some things with help that I couldn't do without help. So you could test some different algebra problems, maybe some easier ones and some harder ones. Then you can give someone help, see if they can do the slightly easier ones and then the slightly harder ones. You could then test this theory by testing a specific hypothesis or specific predictions it makes. So that's what theory is versus hypothesis. The theory is that broad interconnected set of ideas. Vygotsky sociocultural theory. And a hypothesis is using help from other people, I can learn algebra better. That would be a specific hypothesis you would test in a single or multiple studies. So with that, let's talk about some different theories. One is the psychoanalytic theory. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. This was one of the big researchers that you might have heard of, that's a psychoanalytic theorist, is Freud. So Freud, being a psychoanalytic theorist, thought that development was primarily unconscious, was heavily influenced by emotions, that your unconscious motivations drove you to different things. Your id was the unconscious motivator. Generally, it was a psychosexual theory, so some things connected to sexuality were driving any behavior that you ever did. Later psychoanalytic theorists, like Erikson, actually created a lot of good research in development. Freud kind of started it off, so we wouldn't be where we were without Freud, but he's not so relevant to what the field is doing today, so we're kind of skipping over that. So Erikson thought development was in psychosocial stages rather than psychosexual stages, that the social environment that we were in had a bigger impact. So he thought, well, first we're very, very young. We're gaining trust versus mistrust for caregivers. Then later on in toddlerhood, we might be gaining some autonomy versus doubting ourselves. Maybe at preschool level, we might be taking initiatives ourselves versus feeling guilt over things that we're doing, so on and so forth. Or an older adult might be developing ego integrity versus despair over what they've done with their lives. So it is a lot more relevant to what we're doing today, but we have moved past this as well. The stages were all about how we relate to people, and it was important to do this because it did recognize lifespan development versus Freud thought, well, once you're about 5, everything's kind of set, all your psychosexual urges are set, you're kind of just driven by them the rest of your life. So another example or model from Erikson's. So some positives of these psychoanalytic theories is they created some of our first psychological frameworks for development. A lot of the treatments that came out of even Freud's work were a helpful starting point for even current therapies. Like we've developed and built past them now, but they were a good starting point there. Some negatives were they were not falsifiable. You couldn't prove that theory false. So with the theory, with the sociocultural theory we were talking about, you would want to be able to prove that false. You want to state it in a way that it could be proved false. You think your theory is right, obviously, but you want to make it so that it can be tested and then proved false if it is false. So something that, let's go back to the sociocultural theory and talk about falsifiability. One thing that you could do to prove this false is this says that all learning, all development happens in this way, that you're learning, you're growing and developing in this way. What would falsify this? Well, if we had one person who suddenly woke up one day and knew all Spanish, they'd never heard a word of Spanish in their life, but they could speak Spanish completely. They never had help. They never learned it from anyone. They never read it in a book, saw it in a movie, but suddenly they spoke Spanish. That would suggest, well, this theory didn't actually hold up in this person's case. So that's one piece of evidence. Then maybe you find 500 people who that same thing happened to. Maybe they just all of a sudden gain the ability to speak Spanish. And you go, well, maybe Vygotsky's sociocultural theory might not have as much support as we once thought it did. So it does seem, it's a pretty strong theory. It seems to be holding true for a lot of different things. But maybe in the future, we'll see some evidence that maybe people can gain abilities in ways that were not taught to them or they learn through these experiencing processes. It's possible. The theory is written in a way that you could prove it false if that kind of thing happened on a large scale. So that's what we're talking about, falsifiability. All right, cognitive theories kind of came next. Piaget, Erikson were working around the same time. We'll see a lot of Piaget's work. Vygotsky's, we just saw that sociocultural theory, as well as information processing theory. So this thought focused on conscious thoughts. So the things that you can consciously be aware of as you're thinking, rather than unconscious motivations driving you to do things. So Piaget thought that people construct their own understanding of the world. They adapt to new environments, and they consciously think about what they want to do, who they want to be. So his stages were also relevant for child and adolescent development. But one weakness here is he didn't really go beyond that adolescence. He thought once you got to this formal operational stage, about 12, maybe 14 or 16, once you can reason abstractly and think hypothetically, your cognitive development's done. You're done at that point. Whereas we know there's still a lot of neurological development. Well, now we know. He didn't know this. There's still a lot of neurological development that happens until even about age 23. So cognitive capacities are changing. You can still gain new cognitive capacities later on. So we talked about Vygotsky's theory that people construct their knowledge and understanding of the world through their cultural interactions. So here's that model again. Information processing theory kind of looked at computers and said, well, maybe the brain's working a lot like a computer. It's processing information, it's strategizing, it sees the mind kind of as a computer with gradual increases in capacity. So some positives of this view is that it gives a positive view of development, that people can use agency to choose things, they can change the way they're going to be, they can consciously realize their motivations versus psychoanalytic or Freud, who thought you were just completely driven by unconscious motivators. There was an emphasis on the capacities we can build, and there was a lot more scientific studies. So there was research done, and we'll talk about research methods in a few minutes. So they started to do actual scientific research studies. Stages, we know, are not really as valuable in most cases. Most development is pretty continuous with a few specific things that are very discontinuous. And there's very little focus from these researchers on individual differences between peoples, in different cultures, being affected by all the different contexts, which we've kind of grown to now. Another field that has affected development is behaviorism. So I mentioned this a little earlier when I mentioned ABA therapy. So with ABA therapy, we're looking at a behavioral look. We're looking at only those things that we can observe. So I observe a poor behavior, yelling or pulling hair or biting from a young child. When I see that they're doing appropriate behaviors, maybe I give them a reward. I give them a snack. I give them a star, something like that. Some theorists, Skinner, Bandura, we can think of reinforcement, punishment. So reinforcement is anything that increases the probability of a behavior, and then punishment is anything that decreases the probability of behavior. So a reinforcement might be a star. A punishment might be a timeout, something like that. So feel free to watch this video if you have your own time. You've got that link right here in the slides. Download them. You can go to that link. You could also type it out and watch that video to get another couple ideas about behaviorism. So we've also got Bandura's social and cognitive theories. So he took that cognitive information or those cognitive theories, this behaviorism, put them together. Think, well, maybe it's the behavior is also related to environmental factors and personal factors. So cognitive, biological events. You might see how this is kind of evolving into that model that I showed earlier, where kind of everything is affecting everything. The individual capacities are being affected by parents, by schools, by the community, as well as the behaviors you're choosing. So some positives of these behavioral and socio-cognitive theories are that they emphasize science. There was a lot of scientific research, experiments, things like that, and the realization that the environment was very important, which then more recently turned into, well, a realization that so many contexts are important as well. So with that, some negatives The strict behaviorism did not allow for a look at what was happening in your mind, your cognition, what you were thinking, what you could plan yourself. It was strictly looking at behaviors. So, and there was also no overarching developmental theory. So that was a weakness at the time. Now we've moved a little bit to ecological theories. The idea that development reflects the influence of many environmental systems across time, across the entire lifespan. So these words should be familiar to you since it was only about 30 minutes ago that I started mentioning them. So Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory was one of the first big ones. Bronfenbrenner is a big name even currently in developmental science. And then Richard Lerner, took that and applied it in a specific model, the developmental contextual perspective, or the developmental contextual model. That was actually the model I showed you with all the different circles with arrows pointing to each other. That was Lerner's. It's also called the relational developmental systems perspective. Depending on where it was in the timeline of them thinking about it, they describe it slightly differently in papers because their understanding and their pulling things into these theories has evolved over time. So this is kind of where we're at now. We see that these different systems, this is Bronfenbrenner's model. You can see the macro systems are those norms and values of the culture. The microsystem are those immediate things we interact with every day. So your family, your school, your friends, those are probably people you're interacting with every day to every week. The mesosystem is how those are connected to each other. And the exosystem is a little more indirect effects. So government, industry, political systems, so the local government, things like that, that are still going to have an effect on your environment, but maybe not as much of a direct effect on you as your parents or siblings or roommates or spouse, those kinds of things. So another example, so we might see one area where policing is very harsh and very strict versus another area where maybe policing is a lot more lax, and how that might affect the individual behavior of families or friends. And that specific interaction might be the direct effect on you as a person as you develop. So then Lerner took this into this developmental systems theory, this relational developmental systems theory. If you look closely, all these arrows are pointing both ways. This is because there are bidirectional interactions. So bidirectional means two directions. So this child is being affected by their parent, but this child might also be affecting their parent. So let's say you have a child who one of their dimensions is that they are a difficult versus an easy child. And we'll talk about temperaments pretty soon in the course. So a more difficult child might be, let's say an infant is going to be crying a lot more, harder to figure out what they need. Maybe you can't really understand what they're saying. So if they're difficult and they're crying a lot, the parent might get more frustrated, might have less patience for them, might treat that child differently than, let's say they have a twin that is an easy child. It's really easy to figure out what this child needs, help them be happy. You might develop a closer bond with that one that's maybe a little easier, that you know what it needs, than the one that's a little more difficult. So the parent is affecting the child's behavior, but the child can also be affecting that parent's behavior. Similarly, the child can affect their own school network, can affect how teachers perceive them or see them, how their friends perceive and see them and interact with them. So it could be a very positive upward spiral, might be a negative downward spiral. So what we try to do as applied developmental scientists is try and get people on upward, positive developmental spirals, to have positive interactions with parents, peers, schools, communities, environments, to help people thrive and do as well as they possibly can in their lives. So any given study, that like piece of research that's looking at this, might focus down on something really narrow. It might look at just how does a child's personality, or let's say, how does a child's propensity towards crying affect a parent's behavior towards them? So a couple studies focusing on that specific thing. So that's really only looking at this one arrow there. You do another study. How is a very lax preschool versus a very strict preschool versus a preschool with lots of paper learning versus lots of toys and hands-on learning. How does that bidirectional interaction change the capacity of that child to learn in the future? So you're looking at one specific thing. No single study is going to take a look at this entire system. You'll have lots of people, this multidisciplinary research to look at the whole entire system. So some positives of this ecological systems view is you are attempting now in current developmental research to look at that whole picture, to realize, yes, the things that are happening in the community are going to affect your family, are going to affect how a child is raised. So you're trying to get a better job at looking at that whole picture. You're looking at those connections between the individual and all those systems. It's a hybrid between that reductionist looking very exclusively at the child, their inner system, their cognition, how that changes all their behavior, and the big picture. Some negatives, though, are that this is still, I mean, it's been around for a couple decades now, but there are very few suggested research methods on how to look at this whole big picture. There's some work on how to do good research to find some things about that, but we're really still in the early stages of getting good research methods to look at that whole big picture. It's hard to integrate across fields. So when I work with neurologists or political scientists, for example, one of my other colleagues is a political scientist, we speak kind of different languages in our field. So I might describe things in slightly different ways. So it can be hard to integrate across fields. We really need to work multidisciplinarily, but it can be hard. Another is practical research limits. If you get a $4 million grant, you might be able to look at many aspects of that whole big picture, but you still can't look at all of them. So you have these practical limitations of humans' cognitive ability to grasp all those pieces, the time to study those, every single one of those pieces, and the money to study all those individual pieces. So that is a negative of this as well. But we are trying to do a better job looking at the whole big picture of how development helps people thrive throughout life. So the book takes what's called an eclectic theoretical orientation. It doesn't really settle on one or another. It often brings up some of Piaget and Erikson's material because a lot of what they started with really helped along development over time. My personal perspective is this bioecological systems model. So this learner's model, relational developmental systems, ecological systems, everything's affecting everything, and trying to take a look at those different pieces. So the book is going to demonstrate research as it is. There's many researchers. All researchers are coming at things with different assumptions. I just gave you a couple of my basic assumptions I'm coming with. But the book's trying to not take sides, I guess you could say. Most researchers now as well understand that there's value in a lot of these different perspectives. We don't have theorists who think exactly the same as Freud now, even though psychoanalytic theorists today, that theory has evolved to this time. So let's talk specifically about research methods. What kind of research methods do you do? How do you find these things? How do you study human behavior, human development? How do you figure out how people grow and change? How do you put numbers to it? How do you describe it? So one way is through observational studies. Observation is essentially just what it sounds like. You're making observations of people in the real world, their behaviors. You can do naturalistic observation, where you are just watching people behave. For a college setting, if you wanted to learn about college students, you might go to a library and just watch them. You might go to a local Starbucks and watch college students interact to learn about their behavior in the real world. You might also do a laboratory setting where you bring people in and you observe them. You might see that in the natural observation, you can't answer specific questions. You can't control for things like you could in an experiment. Versus a lab, you could have a lot more control over behavior. So that would be observing. You're just looking at what's happening. Maybe you would observe a mother and a child. You might observe a mother and a child in their home in a naturalistic setting. You might observe a mother and a child in a laboratory setting where you kind of set up a specific scenario and see how that turns out. So a survey is another way we do research. We ask people directly, what do you think, feel? What do you understand? How do you behave? Do you do XYZ pro-social behavior is a kind of survey that I've delivered before. You can complete surveys pretty quickly and try to get a good sense of a lot of different variables. Variables, basically any kind of human behavior that can vary. So pro-social behavior. I might do more pro-social behavior than my neighbor. My neighbor down that way might do more pro-social behavior than me. So pro-social behavior varies. I might report my pro-social behavior on a survey. I would get maybe a score of 7 versus my neighbor over there gets a score of 5 versus my neighbor over there gets a score of 10. So that's what a survey is looking to do. Interviews. Ask people direct questions. It can be really hard to ask very young children questions in an interview setting, but for later childhood, adolescence, adulthood, interviews can be a really good way to understand people's behaviors, what they're thinking, what they're feeling. You get a lot of rich and deep data. So as an example, I'm currently doing a study where we're interviewing heroes, a lot of whistleblowers lately. So we're trying to find out how they grew up, what kind of family life they had, what kind of friends, what kind of clubs were they joining. Not directly connected to their heroism, but just seeing if we can pull out commonalities. And it's been really interesting. As we do that, we're getting a lot of deep data about their lives. We can find some similarities between a lot of these whistleblowers. So another way to do research is through standardized tests. You might have known about the SAT, IQ tests are often standardized. You can compare any individual score to other people with the standardized tests. Another is case studies. A case study is a very, very in-depth study about one single case. A case can be one person, so maybe a child genius who can already do calculus at the age of 7. So look at that specific case, or it could be a group. So this is a group. Where are my notes? I think I put, yes, this is a children's club in Cambodia. So this club is entirely run by children. There are no parents interacting, no adults from the community interacting. These children created their own club. They set their own agendas, what they want to do, what they want to play, what they want to learn. And so that specific situation is a pretty unique situation. That doesn't happen everywhere, every day. So that can also be a case. You can look at the case of these children making their own organization. You can also do physiological measures, things like fMRIs, looking at heart rates, looking at hormones, say cortisol, a stress hormone. So why would you use any of these given things? Why would you use more than one? Very often it's important to use more than one of these types of research methods to get at all those different arrows we were seeing with development. So with any given research piece, you might do descriptive research, you might do correlational research, you might do experimental research. So let's talk about those. Descriptive is essentially just trying to describe a phenomenon. Describe maybe how parents interact with their children. Describe how older adults feel about their lives. You might be describing how physical capacity or mental capacity, cognitive capacity changes in between middle adulthood and late adulthood. So these are some methods that you might use there: observations, surveys, interviews. Correlational research looks for relationships between variables. So if I have a pro-social behavior score of 7 versus my neighbor has a pro-social behavior score of 10 versus that neighbor has a pro-social behavior score of 5, well, how does that relate to how often we actually help? How does that relate to how happy we are in life? So you give these numerical values and you look at how one numerical value is related to another. So let's say this is the graph of the correlation between pro-social behavior and happiness. It's not actually that strong of a correlation, but let's just use it as an example. So this is a very strong positive correlation. Correlations range from negative 1.0, so this would be a negative correlation right here, this example. And this example here is a positive correlation. This is a pretty strong positive correlation. This would be like a positive point, let's say 90. So that's a pretty high positive correlation. So a very strong positive correlation is another way to say that. So let's say this side of the graph is happiness or well-being, and this side is pro-social behavior. So that would be saying that people who score higher on pro-social behavior are also tending to score high on happiness or well-being. So that's what you're graphing there. My neighbor over there who got a score of 10 on pro-social behavior, they also scored a 10 on happiness. So they got a point there. I'm scoring 7 on pro-social behavior, so I'm somewhere around here. And I also scored about a 7 on happiness. That's what that's showing. Then my neighbor back here who got a 5, they're scoring somewhere around here, 5 on both. So that's how a correlation works. You're graphing those points together, looking at that relationship. So how close the number is to 1 tells us the strength of that relationship. So a negative 0.90 is a very strong negative correlation. A positive 0.90 is a very strong positive correlation. Let's look at a couple other examples. So let's look, this one is test grade compared to number of parties. So people who go to many parties, high over here, tend to have lower test grades. People that go to fewer parties have higher test grades. So this would be an example of a negative correlation. So it's a pretty strong relationship here. I would say based on the graph, it looks like it's probably like a negative 0.70 versus over here, the length of a lecture, or maybe the length of a lecture video, and the number of yawns someone experiences. If the length of a lecture is 57 minutes by my timer right here, maybe you have many yawns, versus if this was only, say, 5 minutes, maybe you wouldn't have any yawns. So that would be a strong positive correlation. This one probably looks like a positive point, R equals positive 0.65. I'm just making up these numbers just based on what it looks like. You might have no correlation. So this looks like no correlation right here. The number of times your car brakes and the length of the lecture. So whether my lecture today is 5 minutes or 3 hours would not really probably have anything to do with the number of times any individual's car breaks down, right? So there would be no correlation there. Now, some of these relationships that we've been talking about are probably causal. So a length of a lecture is probably causally related, like it's kind of causing more tiredness because it's going longer. But correlation does not mean causation. Let's give an example. This is a graph. Well, it's not actually the graph, but it's an example of the graph. This is a graph of the correlation. It's a strong positive correlation between ice cream sales and violent crime. So what does that mean? There's a strong positive correlation. The more ice cream that's sold is related to how much violent crime there is. So there's, let's say, 25 violent crimes when there are an average of 30 ice creams sold by this one vendor a day. So what does that mean? Is the ice cream causing more violent crime? Is violent crime causing more ice cream sales? Almost certainly not, right? Probably what this means is there's a relationship between these variables. What could be causing both of these things? Think about it for a second. Maybe pause and try to come up with 1 or 2 solutions. Maybe just one even. So really the thing that's causing both of these is the heat. When we see things get warmer, people tend to do more violent crimes. When things get warmer, people tend to buy more ice cream. So ice cream is going to rise at the same time as violent crime, but ice cream isn't actually affecting violent crime, right? So correlation does not mean causation. Just because something is correlated does not mean it is causing another thing. The violent crime is not causing ice cream sales. The ice cream sales are not causing violent crime. They are related to something else that's actually causing both of them. There doesn't have to be a third cause. Things can be related for other reasons, but they might point you towards causes. So how do we figure out what causes things? The only way to do that is through experiments. In an experiment, we will look at 2 or more variables and figure out if one variable, pro-social behavior, is changed by another variable. Let's say teaching about pro-social behavior. So we will manipulate one variable to change something else. So an independent variable is the variable that the experimenter changes or manipulates or alters. The dependent variable is the thing that the final measured variable, the thing that you want to see if it does change because of your manipulation. So with this, in an experiment, you would have at least 2 groups. You generally want to randomly assign them to a treatment and control. So randomization reduces the likelihoods that the effects come from already present differences. So let's say we have a group of aliens. Some aliens are orange, some aliens are purple. So we want to do an experiment and see, well, if we give these aliens, if we show them a video of someone acting pro-socially, will it make them more pro-social? Will they act pro-socially? Will they do helpful behaviors themselves? So we take some of the aliens, and we don't want to split all the orange into one group and all the purple into one group, because that would just tell us not very much. All the changes might be dependent on them being orange or purple aliens, right? So we mix them together. Let's say we put 20 orange aliens in the treatment group and 10 purple aliens. You'd want it to be a little more even, but just the picture, based on the picture, I'm just using numbers to demonstrate. Then in the control group, you try to mix them up as well. You want to be as close to 50-50 as you can. Essentially, you'd use a coin or a computer to say which group they were in. So flip a coin, they go in treatment group, control group, make sure it's random. That's random assignment. And then you would give the treatment group the videos. You would give them a pro-social video, a video of someone helping someone when they fell down on the street. And then the treatment group, or the control group, sorry, you give them essentially nothing. You give them some cookies and you say, thanks, have a good day. Maybe you give them a survey so they think they've done something. Then as they leave, every single one of those people, you have someone fall down with a bunch of books in front of them. And you try to see, well, who helps? Is it more likely that the people that watched the video will help that person who just fell with books? Or sorry, alien that just fell with books? Or is it more likely that the people, or do they all help? Is it not dependent on watching that video? That's an example of an experiment. Another example of an experiment that's actually more relevant to us is you might have a bunch of 4th graders and you wonder, well, will they learn algebra better with some fun videos as part of class, or if I give them more practice problems? So you might say, okay, I've got 3 different classes that I'm teaching my math class to. So one class I'm going to do the videos for. Well, let's say actually first, all these 3 classes are getting about the same grades. It's about halfway through the semester. All the classes are pretty equal in every way. There's a variety of ethnicities, of races. Well, 4th graders are all going to be about the same age. So everybody's the same age. They're all varying socioeconomic status. All the rich kids aren't in one class versus all the poor kids in one class. It's all very varied. So you've got these 3 groups. You give one group the videos as part of their lectures. The other groups, you give the extra problems, the extra homework problems, the workbooks or something like that. And then the control group, the 3rd group, you don't do anything different than you've done previously in the time. Then you can compare at the end of the semester, see who actually did a better job on algebra. Does the group with the videos, are they getting a slightly higher score or a much higher score than the other 2 groups? And that would be another example of an experiment that you might actually do in real life. All right, let's move to time span research designs. These are kind of considered the developmental research designs. There's longitudinal and cross-sectional, and we'll see why. Cross-sectional, you take people of different ages and you compare them on some variable, let's say reading speed or memory, and you will compare them. So you'll take different groups for different ages. You'll take a group of 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and you'll compare, well, how many pages can you read? And that might give you some idea of how reading ability develops. You could also take the 5-year-olds, what do we say, 3, 5, and 7-year-olds. You test their memory. How many letters in a row can they remember? Just random letters. You'll probably find that the 7-year-olds can remember more letters than 3-year-olds. And so you can then infer, well, as you grow older, your ability to read increases. Your ability to remember things also increases. So that is a cross-sectional design. Take people of different ages, and that allows you to infer things about their development. It's nice because you only have to measure them once. I could go and get 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and 7-year-olds today. I go to some preschools and elementary schools and measure those kids all today and get a quick paper out that way. Longitudinal research is a little better in some ways because you would follow a group of kids. Let's say those 3-year-olds, you follow them. You do those same tests. You test these 3-year-olds on their reading ability and their memory ability. So I test their reading ability, I test their memory ability at 3. I come back when they're 5, then I come back when they're 7 and do those same tests again. So the benefit of this is that there are less confounding variables. It's more difficult to do, but it's considered more rigorous. There's less confounding variables because it's those same people. If you take 3 different groups of different ages, they might have had different experiences in their lives, but if you have those same people, you can say, okay, so for these 200 3-year-olds, from the time they were 3 to 5 to 7, they increased in these abilities. It gives you a really good sense of causal change as well. A sequential method, one other weakness of longitudinal is it takes that time. You've got to wait for those 3-year-olds to be 7 to get the final amount of data to publish your paper and know that stuff. But it is really good to do a longitudinal study. So one way to kind of combine those is the sequential method. You take some cross-sectional samples, maybe we take some 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds today, and then we follow them 3 years from now. So then those 3-year-olds are now 5, those 5-year-olds are now 7. So we've got a little bit of both. We've got cross-sectional and longitudinal research. So some other diagrams of those, some examples. So with that, you want to look for cohort effects. If people are born at a same point in history, they share similar experiences. All of us that are alive right now are sharing experiences. Depending on how old you are, you might have experienced 9/11. Depending on, you probably experienced the COVID-19 pandemic and changes with that. So people who are born after this might not have experienced those things, right? So that's a cohort effect. So remember, we've got descriptive research, describing, correlational research, looking at relationships, experimental research, doing experiments, trying to manipulate to see how one thing causes another, and developmental and longitudinal research. These slides are another example of something that I do in the in-person classes, but not always online. A lot of times I will make these in-person activities a discussion board. Not this one though. So another good video to watch would be this one on ethical and unethical research examples. So as we do these experiments, as we do these correlational studies, we want to make sure that we are treating participants well. There's a lot of examples in previous research, especially in psychology and medicine, where humans have not been treated well, especially humans that are, say, lower socioeconomic status or of diverse ethnicities than so because of that, we have rules that were started with the Belmont Report of the American Psychology Association, started with some ethical guidelines. Now, any research institution like the Salt Lake Community College, like the university I go to for my grad school, Claremont Graduate University, anything that might receive federal funding for grants for doing research has to have an institutional review board or an IRB. And for these, essentially, I will send in my proposal for a study to the IRB. I'll say, hey, I want to get 500 participants. I want to give them these surveys. Some of them I'm going to give a video that might make them happy or stressed or feel like doing something pro-social. I give them a report of this is what I want to do. This is the experiment or this is the study. And these are the possible risks to those participants. These are the possible benefits to participants. Some of my studies kind of teach people new skills. And so that's a good benefit for people to get, is those new skills. And so then I say, okay, so IRB, can I do this study? Is it ethical? And so the IRB is a group of people, usually different people from the institution. So you might have some psychologists, some history people, some sociologists, medical professionals, depending on the school you're at, as well as a member of the community that knows and is interested in research. So they'll look at your study and they'll say, well, that's good, that's good, that's good, but you're not treating maybe the participants' data carefully. I've got this on some of my studies. You need to make sure you store any survey data on a password protected like hard drive. Because if someone got that, they could find this individual and who knows what they would want to do with that data, right? So that's one thing I've had to change in my studies in the past, is make sure I'm treating data more carefully and privately. If you looked at those examples of the videos, some of those past studies could have really hurt people. And so the IRB would shut that down and say, nope, can't do that. That's going to hurt people, maybe psychologically, maybe physically. So that is what we do. So now we need to make sure that we give informed consent. Hopefully you have a good understanding of what consent is, agreeing to do something. And then informed consent is participants knowing what they'll be involved with, knowing the risks. So telling them up front, and I give participants a consent form. I say, hey, this is what you're going to be doing. These are the potential risks. These are your potential benefits. Do you agree to do this study now that you know everything about it? So if they don't, then they don't complete the study. I don't force them to do that. They can leave. Confidentiality, keep data confidential. This is where I've got most of my comments on previous IRBs. Make sure that the data is safe. Debriefing. After the study, especially if you had to say lie to someone or manipulate them, let them know what that was about. In one study, I told people they were doing an IQ test when really I was giving them some primes that would hopefully make them be more heroic. So after the study, I had to tell them, hey, this wasn't a real IQ test. Really what we were doing is trying to see if you would be more pro-social when you got these couple questions about being pro-social. So I had to tell them that. And deception, we try not to use that kind of deception unless absolutely necessary. IRBs generally do not like deception to be used in studies. They don't want us to lie to participants. So for I'd say 99% of my studies, I've been totally upfront with my participants. I've said, this is exactly what you are going to do. These are the potential risks. This is about how long it's going to take. Do you want to do this? And a lot of people volunteer and do the studies. So with that, remember, ask me questions if you don't understand. This is the end of chapter 1 lecture. As we're getting to the end, I do want to point out this current model of doing research. So this is actually something that one of my professors in grad school showed to me. And this is kind of the whole idea behind why we do research as developmental scientists. So as a developmental scientist, I want to do these studies on prosocial behavior. I want to do these studies on heroism, on people developing purpose in life. But why do I want to do that? Well, because I see some socially significant problems. Sorry, I'm gesturing on the camera this way, but actually I do think on your screen it is that way. So a socially significant problem might be something like poverty, something like children not being engaged in school. That might be a socially significant problem. So you do some applied research to see how to solve the problem. Say, well, I think this might help. I think having teachers and students talk more every day might help. And then you go out and you try it in the real world. You talk to community practitioners. You talk to teachers, say, hey, do you think this would help? Do you think it wouldn't? Use previous theory from developmental science, and then good research methods, experiments, correlational studies, observational studies, interviews, to try and figure out, will this work? Then once you have some findings, you disseminate to multiple audiences. You tell teachers, well, this is what we found. It did work, it didn't work, this is why it didn't work, this is the things that really worked well. And then you disseminate that. You maybe do more evaluations. Maybe you change policy, maybe change the way teachers are trained. You change basic research. And then you try to solve the problem even further. You do more research. And it's kind of a cycle that goes this way until you solve that problem. So that is the goal of developmental science, is we want to use these previous theories. We want to use these research methods. We want to use what we know about how humans change, how they're influenced by their context, to solve real life problems in the world. Some people developmental researchers only want to just know and describe things, and that is completely fine. I am an applied researcher. I really want to help people change their lives for the better and do that in science. Yeah, do that by science. So that is what we'll be talking about a lot through this class. We'll be covering developmental stages. Next time we'll talk about, in chapter 2, we'll talk about the prenatal development, and then we'll start jumping through the lifespan. So feel free to email me with any questions that you have. That is the end of chapter 1. Hopefully you followed through with this. You can review these notes and slides and make sure that you get your discussion boards done as well on time. And I will see you for the next lecture.